Hi everyone, I'm Deirdre Breakenridge, CEO of Pure Performance Communications. Welcome to the Nasdaq PR Influencer Series. We're live here at MarketSite in Times Square, New York City, and joining me in studio is Helio Garcia. He is the Executive Director of Logos Institute. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Corporate Communications Institute, I believe in Beijing. Hi Fred, it's so nice to see you.
Delighted to be here, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thanks for joining me to talk about leadership, communications, and reputation, all very important in our world right now. And I want to start off because you wrote a book called The Power of Communication. And I read the book, and I've recommended it to many a student and professional.
Thank you.
And we're at a time where we need strong leadership and really good communication. And your book was all about being strategic. So maybe we could just start there with what is strategic communication versus a tactical approach?
Well, thank you for that. One of the things we find is in business and in other forms of enterprise, governments, NGOs, etc., those who run institutions are rigorous in everything they do. But when it comes time to explain what they're doing, they tend to abandon that rigor and they tend to improvise. They would never dream of improvising on a budget. They would never dream of improvising in a legal brief. They would never dream of improvising on a supply chain management challenge, but they improvise in communication. So the first principle has to be that communication is an essential element of business, and we need the same rigor in that communication as in every other form of business, and that's a big part of what the book you mentioned is intended to do. Now, the challenge for many professional communicators is that they get paid, we get paid, to send stuff to people, to engage audiences, but they tend not necessarily to always understand the business purpose of the thing they're communicating. And so the real essential discipline of an effective communicator is to always align the task to the purpose. Strategy is the alignment of tasks to purposes. So let me give you just a somewhat trivial example. I'm often brought into a company and asked to evaluate and assess their communication. And I'll be given some form of communication that they're proud of, say, a weekly newsletter. And I will look at it and I'll say, ooh, it's well designed, the font is readable, the graphics are compelling. And then I'll ask the sponsor of that piece of communication, what is the purpose of this communication? And I'll get something like, well, we send it to employees on Tuesdays. And I'll say, yeah, I get that. And when I say that in big audiences and corporations, they all look at each other and smile and nod and say, oh yeah, we get those. I'll ask 5 or 6 different ways, and I'll keep getting the response, well, it's for employees to get on Tuesdays. And eventually I'll scratch my head, and I'll say, I don't think Tuesday is a purpose.
Exactly.
And if you tell me that employee productivity is low and you've done an employee engagement survey and discovered that employee morale is low because they don't believe they know what's going on and they don't believe the company cares, and once a week we send this out to give people a sense of what's going on and to show how we care about them, then I can understand that purpose and I can begin to assess the effectiveness against that purpose. So one of the things I preach to my clients and to audiences wherever I can is, if you can't articulate a purpose that is not referring to the instrument itself, don't communicate. And imagine how much more efficient businesses would be if we only communicated for a clearly defined purpose. And if, in the absence of a clearly defined purpose, we stopped communicating. Our inboxes would be a lot less cluttered. Our calendars would be a lot less cluttered. We'd go to fewer meetings, and those who matter to us would not get confused by the noise that we tend to generate, and instead we get much more effective interactions with us when they happen.
Absolutely. I mean, there is so much noise. Think of if we lessened that, we would inspire so many more people. Now, I want to talk a little bit about leaders and the qualities of leaders. So, good leadership today, what are some of the characteristics and where does good communications fall into that?
The best definition of leadership I've ever encountered was one articulated by late General and President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower said that leadership is getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it.
Right.
Leadership is a process of inspiring people, of rallying people, of getting people to be loyal, of getting people to trust, of getting people to want to be in relationship. There are other elements of leadership like focus and decision-making ability and many other things, but the necessary element of effective leadership is effective communication, the ability to rally people, the ability to inspire confidence, the ability to inspire trust. Now, here's the challenge. Really interesting research being done all over the place that shows that the higher one goes in the organization, the less success and failure is determined by technical ability. So if you're a finance person, you're a brilliant controller. If you're being considered to be the CFO, a far greater part of the CFO job is engaging stakeholders and inspiring confidence, and has far less to do with being able to keep track of numbers. Keeping track of numbers is a necessary but not sufficient condition of being a CFO. By the time you get to be CEO, about 80% of the job is about getting people aligned, keeping people informed, keeping people aware of what matters, getting people to care about what matters. So the blend of technical skill to communication ability, the leadership part, the higher you go, requires more and more of the communication and less of the technical skill. The technical skill is table stakes.
Right.
But what actually leads to success is effective communication skills, and what leads to failure is ineffective communication. Either ineffective communication skills or an instance where the communication was ineffective that created a career-defining moment. Now, we've seen 4-star generals have to leave the military because they communicated inartfully. We've seen CEOs, even in the last several weeks, no longer be considered to become chairman because they communicated inartfully. So part of what I try to preach to my clients is we want you to build your career by using effective communication, but we want also to avoid a career-defining moment that abbreviates your career.
Well, I do want to touch on that career-defining moment, but first, stepping back just a little bit, getting them more quickly to the good communication and not so much of the technical, which you said is less important. So what does that mean for the folks around them? If you have to build and trust and inspire people, who are you surrounding yourself with?
Well, that's a great question, and I know a large part of our audience here today is public relations people. And one of the challenges of public relations people is they're not often the first person executives turn to for communication help. And one reason, frankly, is because PR people tend to marginalize themselves. And one reason is they tend to talk in PR talk to executives, and executives don't care about PR talk.
No.
They care about things that PR people actually have real expertise in and standing to advise on, but we need to do it in a way that connects with the executive. And when we do that, the executives then want us in the room. So CEOs and other executives care only about 2 questions. This is what keeps CEOs awake at night. The question is, why are they doing this?
Yeah.
Regardless of who they are or
Right.
what this is. Why are our investors not rewarding us for our ability to manage costs and build market share? Why are we not being rewarded? Why are employees not becoming more efficient? Why are customers not agreeing to pay the higher price for the enhanced service? But the CEO loses sleep over why are they, fill in stakeholder, doing this, behaving in a certain way that I wish they would not be behaving. And then the second question, how can we get them to do this other thing? And the PR person is uniquely positioned to be able to answer those 2 questions, because the PR person is the only one in the organization that is responsible for knowing about what matters to every single stakeholder group. Now, marketing will know about the sales force and customers. Finance will know about investors. HR will know about customers. Law or regulatory will know about government. But PR knows about all of them. And when the professional communicators do their best work, it's not because they're talking about communicating. They're talking about how to move people from one way of doing things to another way of doing things. And that's what bosses care about. So bosses surround themselves with people who can actually get stuff done. And we can get those things done too. We can help the boss make smarter decisions, but for that we need to speak in the boss's vocabulary and in the vocabulary of competitive position and competitive advantage, and avoid using words like audiences and press releases and emails. That we need to talk about the people who matter and how to change them, and not the stuff we will do to make them change. Leaders surround themselves by people whose opinions they think they need, not people who are just part of some organization chart. And part of the challenge of professional communicators is to get in the room. And the way to get into the room is to demonstrate value on the things the boss cares about. And to the degree the boss cares about anything that is within our realm, it is understanding those who matter to the boss and how to get those people to behave differently.
That's so important. I'm so glad you discussed the language, because what is important to the communicator and the way that we speak to each other, we have to remember that when you're with a CEO, it is a different language.
In the book that you referenced, my last book, one of the principles is you can't move people until you meet them where they are. Now, that applies to public communication to audiences, but it also applies to giving advice to bosses. So we can't move the CEO unless we meet the CEO where the CEO is. So what does she care about? What is keeping her awake at night? What are the long-term goals and fears that she is grappling with? What pressure is the board putting on her? And the more we know that, the more we can demonstrate value and demonstrate how that boss can navigate in order to get to a better competitive position.
Right, we're there to help.
We're there to help, but we need to help in terms that they understand, not in terms that we understand. I'm the PR person, I'm here to help, never gets us in the door.
No.
But I think I can help you manage your board better.
Well,
okay,
there you go.
Tell me how.
Exactly.
And suddenly we're having a different kind of conversation.
So you had mentioned before, we're just going to pivot a little bit to those moments, those defining moments in someone's career. What happens when an executive or a brand, their image or their reputation is damaged? How can you mend a marred brand?
The first thing to note, if I can be shamelessly self-promotional, is I have another book coming out in about 6 weeks, and it's about decision-making that leaders go through in those very instances where the brand is at risk, or reputation is at risk, or trust is at risk. And there are a number of things that we talk about in the book that the Logos Institute studies very carefully, and we're beginning to harvest in the book. One is that most harm to brand and reputation is self-inflicted harm. It is self-inflicted either because the company, the leaders, do something that causes people to look up and say, whoa, what was that? Or someone does something to the company or the brand, and we fail to respond in a timely and effective way. So the key leadership discipline for CEOs and others, and for those who advise CEOs, is what in the book we call mental readiness. And mental readiness consists of three things. The first is emotional discipline that prevents panic when things are going badly. And when we look at instances of recent CEO failures, it's because in the moment they didn't have emotional discipline. They either ignored, defied, denied, tried to blame somebody else, but they didn't actually behave the way we expect a responsible CEO to behave. The second we call deep knowledge, and that is it's easy to know what works and doesn't work when the brand is at risk, when trust is at risk. There are certain things that never work. There are certain things that always work. There are certain things that work situationally. And what's really interesting is the CEOs who crash and burn do the things that we know never work.
Right.
They blame somebody else, or they evade, or they take too long. The final part of mental readiness is what we call intellectual rigor. And that is there's a rigor to every management process. And we need to bring that rigor into the consideration of trust in crisis. So here's the way I explain it. Trust is a consequence of expectations being fulfilled. And the first question that a CEO needs to ask when the brand or the company's trust or the share price or anything else is at risk is not to ask, what should we do? because then the frame is the we frame.
Right.
And we
About
become
us.
self-protective.
Yes.
I'd like my life back.
Oh, yes. The
Okay,
famous
so
line.
that's
Yes.
what happens. The question we need to ask is about trust and the relationship of trust to expectation. So here's the discipline. We need to ask, or the CEO and the advisors need to ask, what would reasonable people among those who matter to us appropriately expect a responsible organization or leader to do when facing this? Now, example, assume a plane crashes. Reasonable people don't appropriately expect a responsible airline to know the moment it crashes what caused the crash.
Right.
They also don't expect a responsible company to release the names of the dead until the families have been notified. Now, in both of those instances, media will ask. In both of those instances, social media will speculate. Trust doesn't fall if we fail to answer the questions because reasonable people don't expect us to. What do they expect us to? They expect us to care. They expect us to care that something needs attention. They expect us to care that there are victims. They expect us eventually to figure out what happened. But in the early moments of any crisis, the first strategy is to show we care, because the common expectation is that we care. And when you look at crisis after crisis that's mishandled, it's because they fail to show they care in a timely way. But if we show we care in a timely way, trust remains. And if we continue to show we care as the crisis unfolds, trust remains high. There's a first mover advantage in a crisis. And if we're silent, the media and social media and adversaries and critics will paint us as uncaring. And it's much harder to restore trust than it is to maintain trust. And the way to maintain trust in the early phases is to show we care.
Absolutely. And then you'll have a more forgiving public, definitely.
The public is willing to forgive those who acknowledge. But they are not willing to forgive those who evade or who try to blame others or who try to rationalize away the behavior.
Exactly. I want to pivot a little bit to skills development because you have been teaching since 1988 at NYU. And I think it's important just to talk a little bit about communicators today and the importance of skills development.
It is critically important for those who presume to advise leaders, first to understand the environment in which leaders operate.
Right.
So business acumen is a really important discipline, and the NYU program that you and I both teach in has a required course in business acumen, and I applaud that. The other thing to note is that business leaders make decisions in a very rigorous way. And in whatever course I'm teaching, whether it's an ethics course or a strategy course or a crisis course, what I try to impart to my students is a rigorous way of thinking that matches the rigorous way that CEOs and CFOs and chief communication officers and marketers and lawyers think, so that we can demonstrate to those who make decisions that we understand how they think. And my friend Jim Lukaszewski likes to say that PR people are really good at connecting dots, and we're very intuitive, but executives mistrust intuition. So even if we develop our recommendation by connecting dots intuitively, we have to convey the recommendation in a rigorous way. So we need to learn the rigor of effective persuasion for those who are rigorously driven, just as we need to learn the underlying business, the underlying stakeholder concerns. The kinds of professional development I advise professional communicators to do is, you got to be a good communicator. But mostly you need to be a really good anthropologist who can figure out culturally and otherwise what groups care about. So there's an anthropology of investors, and we can predict with precision what investors care about. There's an anthropology of employees, and we can predict with precision what employees care about. There's an anthropology of customers, of regulators, and the more we can predict what they care about, the more we can frame our recommendations to bosses in language they care about, of how to actually move the people that they are concerned about. It's less important to me that the person developing herself or himself to become an advisor to CEOs studies any particular discipline, but rather that they study what it takes to learn about what the boss cares about and about what the stakeholders care about.
So important. So Fred, Last question, super easy. Tell us where people can find out more about you and your work.
The Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership is a subsidiary of Logos Consulting Group. You can find us at logosconsulting.net. I blog, my colleagues blog, I tweet, my colleagues tweet. My Twitter handle is @GarciaHF. I'm on LinkedIn, I have a public Facebook account. I reply to emails, so I'm out there all over the place. My next book is published in about 6 weeks. I will be doing social media around that, so you can find it when it's ready.
And what's the name of the book again?
The book is called The Agony of Decision,
Okay.
Mental Readiness and Leadership in a Crisis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For talking about leadership and communication and reputation. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in to the Nasdaq PR Influencer Series. Stay tuned for more from Nasdaq.